Just about everything we've been told about Ebola since the beginning of the outbreak in West Africa is wrong. The means of transmission, the incubation period, its persistence on surfaces, and even the available treatment methods have been systematically misrepresented. That's an extreme claim, and extreme claims must bear the burden of proof. So let's take a look at the evidence. The corporate media, the CDC, and other so-called authorities have repeatedly insisted that Ebola can only be contracted by direct contact with an infected person or their bodily fluids, and that it does not and cannot spread through the air.
No, actually, you can't get Ebola on the bus.
Ebola is not spread through the air like the flu. You cannot get it from casual contact like sitting next to someone on a bus.
This is false, and they've known that it's false for quite some time now. This 1995 study conducted by the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, entitled Lethal Experimental Infections of Rhesus Monkeys by Aerosolized Ebola Virus, clearly warned of Ebola's ability to spread through the air. The abstract concluded by saying that, quote, demonstration of fatal aerosol transmission of this virus in monkeys reinforces the importance of taking appropriate precautions to prevent its potential aerosol transmission to humans, end quote. In 2010, a study entitled The Survival of Filoviruses in Liquids, on Solid Substrates, and in a Dynamic Aerosol was conducted by the British government's Defence Science and Technology Laboratory. The study found that Ebola Zaire can be viable at infectious levels in aerosols for at least an hour and a half at temperatures just above freezing. They also discovered that in that same temperature range, Ebola could persist on glass and plastic surfaces for over 3 weeks, and on glass surfaces for at least 50 days. Previous research conducted at FSU had established that Ebola could live on surfaces for at least 6 days. The fact that temperature plays such a key role in the durability of the virus could have significant implications for containment in colder climates. Another study, which was conducted in 2012, showed that Ebola was able to travel between pigs and monkeys that were in separate cages and were never placed in direct contact. One of the scientists involved, Dr. Gary Kobinger from the National Microbiology Laboratory at the Public Health Agency of Canada, told the BBC News that he believed that the infection was spread through large droplets that were suspended in the air. Well, what we suspect is happening is large droplets. They can stay in the air, but not long. They don't go far, but they can be absorbed in the airway. And this is how the infection starts. And this is what we think because we saw a lot of evidence in the lungs of non-human primates that the virus got in that way. End quote. Here is the original Canadian study that the BBC article was talking about.
I raised the issue about the potential for airborne transmission being more of a respiratory transmitted agent. And this, I think, I'm bringing it up today, is more of a classic example of what we shouldn't do. I raise that because I've been talking to a number of Ebola virologists who are very concerned about it. And they were concerned about it. That made me concerned about it, okay? Some of them have spoken out. They've been cited in the media recently talking about it. Well, you know what? I was one of those people early on explaining why HIV was never going to be a respiratory pathogen. Because we understood the physiology of the lung, we understood which cells the virus was in, and we understood that that was not going to be an issue. That's different than this. Number one, we've had examples with subhuman primates where transmission of Ebola virus has occurred by the respiratory tract. We had one where pigs transmitted to subhuman primates, and it was interesting because one of the bioinformatics people who commented a lot on this actually said, well, see, that's not a problem because they think it was just from cleaning up the litter on the floor that did it, which is even worse if they had thought through it. The virus actually was deposited on the floor and re-aerosolized with the litter. I mean, that even's worse, okay?
The website of the Public Health Agency of Canada made a statement dating back to at least October 28, 2011, which also confirmed that Ebola was capable of spreading through the air. The page stated that, quote, 1 to 10 aerosolized organisms are sufficient to cause infection in humans. They also stated that in the laboratory, infection through small particle aerosols has been demonstrated in primates, and airborne spread among humans is strongly suspected. The Canadian government stood by that statement for 3 years, but for some reason, they changed the page sometime between August 22nd and August 27th, 2014, and they removed the references to airborne spread among humans. Fortunately, archive.org has multiple cached versions of the page. We also have this article from CIDRAP, the Center for Disease Research and Policy, which states the following. Quote, we believe there is scientific and epidemiologic evidence that Ebola virus has the potential to be transmitted via infectious aerosol particles both near and at a distance from infected patients, which means that healthcare workers should be wearing respirators, not face masks.
David Sanders is a top Ebola virologist and professor of biological sciences at Purdue University. Doctor, great to have you here.
Glad to be here.
Why do you believe that Ebola could be transmitted via the air?
There are two basic points. The first is that a very closely related virus called Ebola restin is known to spread between animals by an airborne route. That's what all the evidence suggests. The second point is the result of our own research that shows that Ebola Zaire enters human lung cells from the airway side. So it has the inherent capacity to enter the lung from the airway.
Interestingly, Ebola's ability to spread through the air has also attracted the interest of the US military. This article from the Army Times confirms this. Quote, filoviruses like Ebola have been of interest to the Pentagon since the late 1970s, mainly because Ebola and its fellow viruses have high mortality rates. In the current outbreak, roughly 60% to 72% of those who have contracted the disease have died. And its stable nature and aerosol make it attractive as a potential biological weapon. End quote. That statement is interesting on a number of levels. Now, when a virus can be transmitted via aerosols, what this means is that it can spread through coughing and sneezing. Virus researcher Charles L. Bailey, who supervised the government's response to an outbreak of Ebola restin in 1989, recently made the following statement to the LA Times. Quote, we know for a fact that the virus occurs in sputum, and no one has ever done a study disproving coughing or sneezing is a viable means of transmitting. Unqualified assurances that Ebola is not spread through the air, Bailey said, are misleading. End quote. About 3,000 aerosol droplets are expelled in a single cough. These droplets fly out of the mouth at speeds of up to 50 miles per hour. A single sneeze can expel up to 40,000 droplets. The vast majority of the droplets are less than 100 microns across. That's the width of a human hair. Many are so tiny that they can't be seen with a naked eye. Droplets which are 5 microns or less across can stay airborne almost indefinitely, as they are lifted and dispersed by airflow. When a person is sick, the droplets in a single cough may contain as many as 200 million individual virus particles. Now remember, in the original version of their page on Ebola, the Public Health Agency of Canada stated that 1 to 10 aerosolized organisms are sufficient to cause infection in humans. You might hear people downplay this risk by referring to the fact that current strains of Ebola don't actually cause coughing or sneezing. True, but does Ebola make people immune to the common cold, the flu, or seasonal allergies? It doesn't matter what triggers the cough or the sneeze. Even a smoker's cough would be sufficient to project infected aerosols. Now, I've reported on the fact that Ebola can spread through the air since the very beginning of the outbreak in Guinea. The reason I knew to search for the evidence that we ended up referring to is because in the 90s, I read The Hot Zone, and that book documented at least 2 cases where in-air transmission was suspected. You'll find these references on pages 91 and 316. In the middle of October of 2014, the CDC finally put out a document admitting that Ebola could travel through the air in droplets, and that it could last for several hours on surfaces. Of course, admitting that Ebola can actually be viable for over a month on surfaces would scare people, so telling the truth is out of the question. At this point, they claimed that these droplets could only travel 3 feet, but this 3-foot limitation is completely fabricated. A study conducted by MIT in early 2014 found that aerosolized droplets from coughs or sneezes can travel 200 times farther than scientists had previously believed. And scientists previously believed that the limit was 6 feet. So that's 1,200 feet. The MIT study demonstrated that the smallest droplets can easily span the entirety of a room and travel through ceiling ventilation units. The CDC's latest claims, on the other hand, are not based on any study. In fact, if you look at the CDC's own website describing how the flu is transmitted, they clearly state that it is spread through droplets as well. But on this page, they say that 6 feet is a limit. Furthermore, this half-baked backpedaling comes after 7 months of telling the public that the disease could not travel through the air at all. Hold on a second, I gotta take this call. Hello?
Dude, the CDC changed their story again.
The CDC did what?
They changed their story about the droplets.
Again?
Yep.
So it's how many feet now?
They say it's 6 feet.
Great.
Dude, is there a problem?
No, it's... This video is taking me forever. I keep having to change things because they keep changing their story.
Yeah, I know, man, but I really think you should update it.
Okay, I'll tell them. The CDC now says that Ebola can travel up to 6 feet in the air. But this time, they really mean it. So feel free to go ahead and print out thousands of copies of our new poster. We promise we won't update you with the information that we already have that debunks it for a while. This is serious. There are people who are dead because they made the mistake of taking the CDC at their word. As of October 16th, 2014, 427 Ebola aid workers had been infected. By October 22nd, just 6 days later, that number had risen to 443. These are people who are following the official protocol. They are wearing goggles and face masks, and they are covered from head to foot with plastic. The first Ebola transmission in the US was to a nurse who was wearing full protective gear as well. That should tell you something. Oh, they'll come up with excuses, they'll talk about mishaps and breaches of protocol. But the real answer should be obvious. Their protocol is wrong.
Inconceivable! You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
When confronted with this evidence, you'll find that some people will respond by asking,
If Ebola is really so contagious, then why hasn't everyone who spent time with infected individuals gotten sick?
well, have you ever had one person in your house come down with the flu without spreading it to everyone else? Of course you have. And your entire household wasn't dressed up in full protective gear, were they? This is actually a perfectly fair comparison. Scientists have a measurement that they use to describe how contagious a pathogen is. It's called the R0 or R0 number. The R0 for the seasonal flu is 1.3 on average. The R0 for this current Ebola outbreak has been estimated to stand at 1.7. The R0 number represents the average number of people one sick individual will infect. These numbers can and do fluctuate over time with environmental conditions, viral mutations, and public health response. In that context, keep in mind that Ebola's R0 number is where it is in spite of an extreme effort to contain it. This containment involves preventing Ebola patients from mingling with the general population as they do with the flu. Without these containment measures, the R0 for Ebola would be much higher. Now you'll hear some people downplay the danger posed by this Ebola outbreak by comparing the death toll in its early stages to more established diseases like the flu. This is broken logic. Ebola's mortality rate as a percentage of total infections is many hundreds of times higher than the flu. The only reason the flu has killed more people than Ebola so far is because the flu is already endemic. The flu is firmly established all over the globe, while Ebola has been historically limited to tiny regional outbreaks that burn themselves out in a matter of weeks or months. This outbreak in West Africa, however, has broken that precedent. It's not burning itself out like a grass fire, and containment methods that worked before are no longer working. Why? Though increased population density and modern transportation are certainly major factors, we now know that there's another significant variable which is contributing to the level of contagion. If you read news reports about this outbreak carefully, you will often see people referring to the virus as Ebola Zaire. This is inaccurate. The outbreak, which began in Guinea, is a new virus. In our previous video on the topic entitled Ebola, What You're Not Being Told, we reported on the fact that Ebola Zaire had mutated. But at the time, it was uncertain whether this mutation was contributing to the unprecedented speed at which the disease was spreading. However, now we have new information.
Today I've been given permission, something I've known about for a few weeks. When I wrote the piece, I knew about this and it's concerned me greatly. Gary Kobinger and colleagues at Winnipeg, the Canadian National Lab, actually took one of the strains from Guinea and put it into macaques a little over a month and a half ago. What they saw was remarkable. It was unlike any of the Ebola viruses they've seen in monkeys. It was much, much more severe. The pathology in the lungs was remarkable. And as Gary said, who is one of the most prominent Ebola virologists in the world, said, it is very worrisome to me about what I saw there. Maybe this is a different virus. Maybe there is that possibility, because you have that much virus in the lungs, maybe somebody might cough it up, and maybe you might get a cycle. Now, I'm not saying that here to scare people. Plan B. What the hell are we going to do if we suddenly see the potential for transmission that might be respiratory in nature?
Peter Yarling, chief scientist at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, recently told reporters that he sees evidence that the new strain has mutated in such a way that it enables it to spread more easily. Quote, viral loads are coming up very quickly and really high, higher than they are used to seeing, end quote. What this means is that this new strain of Ebola replicates faster than previous strains. This makes it more contagious for two reasons. Because fluids and droplets from the patient contain more virus, and because the viral load most likely gets high enough to be contagious slightly sooner. And this new strain is continuing to mutate. A recent study found that new variants are rapidly appearing. And overall, Ebola is mutating almost as fast as a seasonal flu. Scientists agree that this will eventually lead to a meaningful adaptation. However, Gary Kobinger and Peter Yarling's findings indicate that it already has. This also means that the Ebola vaccines that are currently being developed may offer no long-term protection at all. Since the very beginning of this outbreak, we've been told that Ebola has an incubation period of 21 days. and that those who are infected are never contagious until they present certain symptoms, specifically a high fever. We now know that both of these assumptions are false. It turns out that the incubation period for Ebola isn't always 21 days. According to the WHO, 5% of those infected fall outside of this. As of October 14th, they now claim that 95% show symptoms within 21 days and 98% show symptoms within 42 days. But what about the other 2%? That isn't clear from their article. However, it might have something to do with the fact that some individuals can carry Ebola without showing any symptoms. This was reported in 2000 by the New York Times.
I have personally heard from clinicians with a whole series of cases where people did not ever present through the entire time from the admission to the treatment center until they died that ever had a documented 105 or 101.5 fever. They never did. Well, now we have focused so heavily on fever for screening in our clinics and so forth. What if somebody presents and doesn't have a fever? What happens then when the media gets all over it and said, you told us there would be a fever, and you told us that, but now this patient's been found to really have Ebola but didn't have a fever. You didn't know what you're talking about.
We either stop Ebola now, or we face an entirely unprecedented situation for which we do not have a plan.
For the majority of this outbreak, Ebola's spread has been exponential, with the number of cases doubling approximately every 24 days. These numbers fluctuate, and this leads to some confusion. This is partly due to bad reporting. It is estimated that the actual number of infections is 2.5 times higher than the number of confirmed cases. And some witnesses claim that local health officials are deliberately fudging the numbers to avoid panic. As a result, depending on which source you refer to and when, you may alternately come away with the impression that the worst is behind us and the situation is normalizing, or that the crisis is just getting started, and that there is a real risk that the disease will not only become a global pandemic, but also become endemic. For example, in late October of 2014, the world breathed a sigh of relief following an announcement made by the WHO that the number of cases in Liberia seemed to be slowing. This news was enough to overshadow reports indicating that the situation in Sierra Leone was deteriorating, the number of cases in Guinea had begun to accelerate, and by mid-November, Mali was experiencing a new flare-up as well. It's also important to note that this reported slowdown came right after the WHO significantly altered their calculation method to only include data from each of the country's situation reports. But even with this questionable accounting, by November 14th, the rate of new infections in Liberia was already on the rise again. This according to a report by the UN. To put this into context, in August of 2014, when the death toll stood at 826, some scientists claimed that the outbreak was already starting to lose momentum. This optimism was obviously premature.
I believe this will be an endemic disease. I think we will see peaks and troughs. And we have to be careful about the peaks and troughs. I've worked very closely with MSF over the past few months. And again, an organization that if anybody could win a second Nobel Prize, they should. And they have seen themselves this flash of cases, elimination of cases, shut down the clinic move, flash of cases, bring it back, shut it down, flash of cases, bring it back. We don't really understand what's going on in all that area. That's a huge piece.
The operative term here is endemic. Will Ebola become established in enough places to put its complete eradication or even containment out of reach? That's what's really at stake here. Though many media pundits will hype up each case that lands in a first world country and squeeze every last bit of sensational reporting out of them, the real danger isn't likely to come from a few infected travelers from Africa that slip into the United States or Europe. In first world countries, when the infections are happening one or two at a time, the level of attention placed on each case is so high that containment is probable, even when you have epic failures like we saw in Dallas. However, the longer the epidemic in West Africa continues, the more likely it becomes that it will spread to developing countries. Countries in Africa, Asia, or Latin America. Consider, for example, what would happen if Ebola reached a crowded slum in India, or one of the densely populated ghettos of Mexico City.
If West Africa was a can of gas waiting for a match to hit it, the rest of Central Africa is a tanker truck waiting for a match to hit it. And we don't quite get that yet. And there is no plan B. There is no plan B. How would we fight this if, in fact, this were to suddenly flare up in one of these cities along the belt in Equatorial Africa? What would we do? Could we fight it on two fronts? We can't fight it on one front.
It should be obvious that in countries that are already struggling with basic healthcare and sanitation issues, Ebola would easily get a foothold and begin to spread. This would force the already insufficient aid effort to divide itself geographically. and containment would rapidly become impossible. Now, anyone care to guess what will happen if Ebola becomes firmly established in Latin America? Well, that constant flow of migrants across the southern border of the US would suddenly become more than a political football. Illegal immigrants don't enter through official channels. They don't pass through airport screening. Most either cross the border on foot or are smuggled in by men referred to as coyotes. The journey involves long stretches where dozens of people are tightly packed into trucks or vans, and when they arrive, they usually end up sharing small, overcrowded living spaces with other workers. Illegal immigrants do their very best to avoid attracting the attention of authorities. Aid workers attempting to identify and isolate the infected would have to contend with both language barriers and patients who are afraid of getting caught. The first clusters would begin in the poorest neighborhoods and spread out from there. Before it was even clear what had happened, the US would have a full-blown epidemic on its hands. As you can imagine, this would awaken latent xenophobia and racism on a massive scale. However, this fear and anger would be misdirected. Targeting immigrants won't do any good at all. If this virus is going to be stopped, it must be stopped in Africa. Now. Those who think that the US or Europe could brush off thousands of simultaneous Ebola cases are wrong. There are only 4 hospitals in the US with full isolation units capable of properly containing pathogens which can spread through the air. These facilities are located in Missoula, Montana, Bethesda, Maryland, Atlanta, Georgia, and Omaha, Nebraska. The current system simply is not ready for something like this. The danger here goes beyond the disease itself. People would start to panic long before Ebola reaches their city. Stock markets would also panic. Economies would destabilize, and constitutions and civil liberties would be suspended as governments scramble to contain the epidemic. In fact, people will be literally begging the government to take away their freedoms. The calls for complete militarized border lockdown and travel bans would reach a fever pitch. However, those calling for these measures would be caught off guard by what they get. In the context of the economic fallout that would accompany a true outbreak, countries like the United States, which are already sitting on powder kegs of internal division, inequality, and discontent, would almost certainly see widespread social unrest. If you think that this will all be handled in an orderly fashion, you might want to take a look at what happened during Hurricane Katrina. We've been told that there are no readily available treatments for Ebola, and that our best hope lies in the development of new vaccines and experimental drugs in development, which are not likely to reach affected regions in the quantities needed anytime soon. Fortunately, this too is false. A doctor in rural Liberia has used an HIV antiviral called lamivudine to successfully treat Ebola patients. Apparently 13 out of 15 of those he treated survived. The 2 patients who died received the drug very late into the illness. This suggests that if administered early on, lamivudine may offer an even higher survival rate. You would think that as soon as this information went public, they would be sending this stuff into Africa by the truckload. But for some reason, that's not happening. In fact, no one is even talking about this drug as an option. Why not? Why aren't they at least testing it? There are other treatments that also show promise, but they aren't being talked about either. One of them is colloidal silver. A study entitled Interaction of Silver Nanoparticles with Tachyreeb Virus, which was conducted by researchers at the Applied Biotechnology branch of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, demonstrated that silver nanoparticles are not only antibacterial, but are also antiviral. It inhibits virus replication within cells. The study specifically mentions the fact that the virus they tested with has a similar replication cycle to other important viruses such as filoviruses. Ebola is a filovirus. Additional studies have confirmed the antiviral properties of colloidal silver against hepatitis B, monkeypox, herpes, and even HIV. Now, obviously we have no guarantees, but if colloidal silver slows down Ebola's replication cycle even slightly, this would help improve the survival rate. And colloidal silver, unlike proprietary pharmaceuticals, can be purchased in your local health food store, ordered online, or you can even manufacture it yourself. It's an option that doesn't place you at the mercy of health officials or the drug supply chain. Given that this current strain of Ebola kills approximately 70% of those infected and finishes off its victims in a rather gruesome fashion, the fear factor in this crisis is considerable, and for those living in affected regions, the danger cannot be ignored. However, fear is a danger in and of itself, especially when it grips the mind of the crowd. Remember, fear shuts down the logical and rational parts of our brains. You haven't seen stupid till you've seen stupid meet scared. If you're facing real danger, you need to have your head on straight to take action. If you're being lied to, you need to be thinking clearly to sort it out. But if you're scared stupid, that's not going to happen. We cannot afford to succumb to fear, especially in a time of crisis. So be wary of anyone who tells you that you should be afraid, regardless of what you're being told to fear, especially when commercial interests are involved. And be on the lookout for the redirection tactic. If someone tells you that you shouldn't be afraid of topic A, but that you should be afraid of topic B instead, and should therefore take some action that they recommend, often involving a product or service of some kind, that's emotional manipulation. Let's look at an example. Lately, it's become quite common to hear media pundits hype up the threat posed by seasonal flu. You'll even hear them say that it's more dangerous than Ebola.
Best advice for you and your family at this moment? Get a flu shot. Unlike Ebola, flu is easily transmitted. Flu, along with resulting pneumonia, killed 52,000 Americans last year alone. A flu shot will reduce your chance of getting flu. So get one.
Ooh, 52,000? That's a really big number. Scary stuff, at least for people who are incapable of performing basic math. You see, according to the US government, between 5 and 20% of US residents get the seasonal flu each year. With a total population of 319 million, this translates into somewhere between 15.9 and 63 million people infected on a yearly basis. The CDC estimates that between 1976 and 2007, yearly flu-associated deaths ranged from a low of about 3,000 to a high of about 49,000. On average, about 90% of those who died were adults 65 and older. So if you have an unusually cold winter one year and 52,000 people die out of a total of 63 million infected, what is the kill rate? Do the math, and what you get is 0.082%. And remember, 90% of these deaths are people over the age of 65. If you were to run these numbers based on how many people under 65 the flu kills each year, the number would be 0.008%. So if you're under 65 and you get the flu, you have a 0.008% chance of dying. This is before even factoring in variables like your general health. It's categorizing smokers and heroin addicts in with people who take care of themselves. So the real number for you is probably much lower. Oh, and the vaccines that these people are telling you to get to protect yourself from this dire threat, turns out they don't work very well. Flu vaccines are believed to have an efficacy of about 59% for adults under the age of 65 when the strains in the vaccine and those in circulation are well matched. But because the virus mutates constantly, the strains are often not well matched. So the real number is lower. Furthermore, these same vaccines are only 9% effective for people over 65. And remember, 90% of those killed by the flu are over 65. If that wasn't enough, a recent study by the University of Michigan demonstrated that getting a flu shot 2 years in a row actually lowers your protection. And all of this is before even taking into consideration the potential side effects. I challenge you to go to your local pharmacy and ask them for a copy of the ingredients list for the flu vaccine. Then take that list home and look up each of the chemicals and their respective properties. If you can be scared into getting a vaccine that doesn't even work to avoid a mild sickness like the flu, which kills a very small percentage of those that it infects, as 40% of US residents apparently are, and quite frankly, you'll probably fall for anything. Blind faith is dangerous, and the stakes are about to get much, much higher. The so-called mainstream media, the CDC, and the rest of the US government have proven time and time again that they cannot be trusted. Some believe that this is merely the result of mass synchronized incompetence, the failings of a crumbling bureaucratic empire that is leaking money, geopolitical influence, and legitimacy. Others believe that malfeasance is involved, or a combination of the two. The topics that question opens up are a source of a great deal of controversy, and we don't really have time to address them properly here. In the real world, it may not end up mattering at all. At this point, Mother Nature is rolling her dice with every replication cycle of the virus. No one can predict where those dice are going to land. No one. And they certainly can't control it. Now, the vast majority of humanity doesn't want to see Ebola become endemic in multiple regions. But will they take intelligent action and on time, or will they put their faith and their lives in the hands of these bumbling bureaucrats? Like it or not, there's a good chance that that decision will affect you and your family. It's generally a good idea to hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. This means having a plan B and possibly even plan C. Until Ebola has several clusters in one or more developing countries outside of West Africa, we should stick to plan A. Plan A is to get the truth about the means of transmission, incubation time, persistence on surfaces, and alternative treatment methods out to as much of the public as possible, especially to those in countries that are already fighting the disease. Plan B is your family and community's isolation and containment plan. If Ebola gets established in your area and public health officials continue to spread false information, then it will be in your interest to take your safety into your own hands. However, in order to succeed, some precautionary steps should be taken before a crisis seems imminent. Rethinking your location is one of these steps. You do not want to find yourself in the middle of a densely populated city, surrounded by panicked crowds who expect the government to ride in and save the day. If you have the means to do so, it would be wise to consider relocating to a rural area. Living in a rural area provides a buffer between you and the epicenter of the crisis. It also opens up food and water sources which are not dependent on the system. This principle doesn't just apply to Ebola. Given the level of instability we're seeing around the world right now, transitioning into a rural lifestyle is a good idea no matter how you cut it. If getting out of the city isn't an option for you, then at the very least you need to make sure that you have enough food and water stored up to self-isolate for long periods of time. This is a good idea regardless of whether this crisis escalates or not. Having a backup supply of food and water for emergencies is just wise. Now, taking a step back, perhaps an even more important question, a question that many are hesitant to ask, is whether you would want to ride out a crisis like this, the government you're currently living under. If not, then you need to have the means to leave. And that means at the very minimum, you need a passport. You also need to know what you would carry with you if you had to leave on short notice. You need to have those items ready and have the luggage to carry them. If you've been planning on leaving your country, don't put it off. Getting established in a new culture and learning a new language is difficult and stressful. It takes a long time to get your bearings. Now, getting established in a foreign country is also very expensive, especially if you travel like a tourist, staying in hotels and renting cars. The financial component can put this out of reach for many people. There is, however, a way to get a foothold in a new country with minimal cost. There is a work exchange program called Worldwide Opportunities on Organic Farms, or WOOF, which enables you to spend months working in rural areas all over the world with room and board covered. This is interesting on a number of levels. It gets you out of the city, it gets you instantly immersed in the language and culture, and it gives you the chance to learn farming and construction skills. Now, no matter which location you choose, it is going to be in your interest to have those around you understand what is happening. The more people who know that Ebola can travel through the air, can persist for long periods of time on surfaces, can have an incubation period that lasts up to 42 days, and be spread by people who don't have a fever, and the more doses of alternative antivirals available, the better your community's chance of containment will be.